Welcome and thanks for joining us on the Flourishing Life podcast, where we will be discussing what we see on the daily. We're Jackie and Tad from Flourish Medical and Wellness in Savage, Minnesota, where listening to our patients is the priority. Our foundational medicine clinic bridges the gap between traditional and functional medicine. We are pattern recognition specialists that focus on individualized patient care and health optimization. With a combined 30 years of medical experience, our goal is to provide insights that will help you take control of your health. Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Flourish Medical Wellness and on our website, flourishmedicalwellness.com, to stay up to date with what's happening at the clinic. The following content is the opinion of Jackie and Tad Tavis and is not intended to diagnose or treat any medical conditions. Please be sure to speak to your healthcare provider for your unique needs.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Flourishing Life podcast. This is Tad and Jackie from Flourish Medical and Wellness, where our priority is listening to you, our patients, and practicing a team approach to foundational wellness is what we are about. So today we are going to be talking with you about insulin resistance, blood sugar, metabolic health, and continuous glucose monitors, or CGMs. So this is a very common thing that we talk about probably on a daily, weekly basis for sure with our patients. So Tad, why don't you kind of start off with explaining this a little bit as far as what is blood sugar and what that looks like?
In America, high blood sugar is one of the big contributors to chronic disease. When we typically talk about insulin resistance, the reason for that insulin resistance is that repetitive exposure to high levels of sugar, high levels of carbohydrates, things that drive blood sugar up after eating. And what happens is that causes inflammation over time. And that insulin resistance, that is a huge contributor to things like heart disease, which is the number one killer of adults in this country. Now, one of the things that has contributed greatly to this whole situation is how prevalent processed foods are. And we see these hyperpalatable processed foods that are very, that lack a lot of nutrients, but they're very easy to eat. They're very easy to eat in higher quantities than what we're meant to eat them in. And that contributes to sugar overload, carbohydrate overload, and essentially a caloric excess and a nutritional deficit. And that is one of those things that also perpetuates that chronic disease cycle.
So typically with that, what we're seeing is people are overfed, yet they're undernourished.
Exactly. And the reason why is they are these processed foods are so deplete of actual nutrients that the body needs. Whereas when we flip the script and looked at natural foods, so think about lean protein sources, vegetables, fruits, they're going to be lower in terms of caloric density, but much higher in terms of nutrient density, the opposite of these ultra-processed foods. In people who are primarily getting their calories from ultra-processed foods, on average, those individuals are going to eat 400 to 500 or more calories per day compared to individuals who are primarily eating natural or whole foods. And then on the flip side of things too, when we look at how our body responds in terms of satiety, or how does our body react to certain types of foods when we are looking at those more nutrient-dense foods or natural foods, the body is going to reach satiety more quickly than with those foods that are much less nutrient dense, those processed foods.
Yeah. So one of the things I like to kind of take away from that is understanding that the body doesn't count calories. It counts nutrients. And so you can't just say, hey, I'm getting a certain number of calories in today, because if those calories aren't nutrient dense, the body still feels hungry. It still feels the need to eat because it's not getting the nutrients that it needs.
Exactly. And calorie counting does have its place. At the same time, just calorie counting without looking at composition of what a person is eating is really missing the whole other half of the picture.
Yeah. Okay. So let's do a quick little pathophysiology about insulin, blood sugar, what that all is and how that works. So typically when we eat foods, nutrients, some of our food is turned into sugar. And that sugar is used for cellular energy. So when we eat, the body will release a hormone called insulin. Insulin is responsible for bringing that sugar from the blood into the cell for energy. If we have excess sugar that we've taken in through our food, then that will get stored as glycogen in the liver, so some sugar storage. And then anything above and beyond, if our glycogen stores are full, everything else gets stored as fat.
Correct.
So it's really important to understand that process because, again, if we're overfed and we're eating more and more because we're not getting the nutrients, we're storing more and more and more sugar in fat because our body isn't able to use it and it's already overwhelmed and flooded with these high sugars.
Exactly.
Okay, so the other side of this is how is that energy being used? I kind of like to break it down to 3 different ways. So number 1, you take in the food, it turns into sugar. Your body uses that for energy. Once that is used up, then your body will go to the glycogen stores for energy. And once the glycogen stores are used up, then it can actually go to the fat stores and burn fat for energy. And that's kind of where we get that idea of ketosis. So if we're looking toward losing weight, specifically fat, we really need to be tapping into the fat burning for energy and not just hanging out in the glycogen and what we're taking in via food for energy. We have to be able to tap into those fat stores.
Absolutely. And that's where specific strategies to be able to get beyond recently available glucose as well as glycogen become so important, because for some individuals physiologically it can be very difficult to get to that fat burning stage.
Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit about ways to do that. A lot of people don't realize this, that it's not this overnight thing. Diabetes doesn't occur overnight or even in a year. It can take up to 10 to 15 years for someone to develop diabetes, which is partly why we're seeing it younger and younger, because our food supply and our food sources are so not nutrient dense,
nutrient deplete.
Deplete, thank you. And so we're seeing it at younger ages, but it's not going to be necessarily, unless it's a type 1, it's not going to be at 2 or 3, right? It's going to take time for that to build up, but we are seeing it in our elementary school kids and our middle school kids. And so the first thing that happens is that liver starts to get clogged down with this excess sugar, this excess glycogen, this excess cholesterol. And then when that happens, our liver can't release the glycogen like it should. So thinking of kind of this liver clogging, and then we develop some insulin resistance where there's this constant high sugar. And so our body's making more and more and more insulin to try and get that down, but now it's not as effective. It's more resistant to that because of such high levels.
Yeah, and that insulin resistance is so impactful on the development of chronic disease. And that's why we track that. That's why it's such an important marker to track at least annually, if not more often. That said, insulin resistance, when we start seeing that, especially in young people, it is a really good indicator of metabolic health. How metabolically healthy is this child or adolescent, or even in the adult world?
Yeah. And so the other key thing to remember as we go throughout this talk is that insulin, specifically the hormone insulin, is a fat storage hormone or a growth hormone. So it makes things grow. It makes us grow, which as an adult, we don't really want that anymore. We want to stop growing. So it's important to understand that the right amount of insulin is very helpful for the body, but too much insulin is going to lead to excess fat. The other piece is that insulin is anti-lipolytic, meaning it is anti-fat burning, or it prevents fat burning. And so again, if we get into this state of super high insulin, it actually makes it harder for us to get into that fat burning for energy.
Absolutely. And you and I see this in the clinical setting every week, where somebody comes in, new patient, either diabetic or more pre-diabetic, somewhere along that insulin resistance spectrum. And it's the same story. I've tried this, and this over the past 5 years, and nothing works. I just cannot lose this body fat.
Okay. So that is kind of a background pathophysiology about insulin, blood sugar, fat burning, all of those things. The other piece that is important for people to understand, we have some hormones that are what I refer to as circadian hormones, meaning they're triggered and signaled by the light. So as the light comes up, the sun comes up, we have certain hormones that are going to be produced more. As the sun goes down, light is diminishing, we're going to have other hormones that are produced more. And so cortisol is one, and that basically always tags along with insulin. So in the morning when cortisol is up, our insulin is going to be the most sensitive. Once we get to noon and those evening hours, that is when cortisol is supposed to be falling. And insulin is also going to be falling. And then melatonin is starting to spike up, our hormone melatonin, to help us with sleep. So that means that if we're going to have larger meals or carb heavy meals, to eat those meals more in line with our natural circadian hormonal rhythm, we need to be eating those earlier in the day. And we should really be trying to limit a lot of our carbs and sugars afternoon, because that is when we are more insulin resistant. So again, remember, morning, sunrise, cortisol, insulin are working well. As the sun goes down, cortisol and insulin aren't working as well. So we need smaller meals, less carbs in the evening, so that melatonin can then start to peak and get us ready for sleep.
Yeah, and that's an incredibly important pearl for people listening is in American society, on average, most people eat their largest meal of the day in the evening for dinner.
All the time.
And that is where a reasonably or bigger meal there isn't the end of the world, but if it's heavy on carbs at that time, that's what really kills us in adulthood in terms of that insulin resistance development.
And I hear this a lot, people coming in with sleep issues, like, why can't I sleep? Well, are you having a snack before bed? Okay, well, if you're having a snack before bed, your body needs to make insulin to take care of that snack, which then it can't make melatonin appropriately. So you're literally swapping out insulin and cortisol for melatonin. So of course you're not going to sleep as well. The other thing a lot of people do before bed is look at their screens. Blue light is insulinogenic, meaning it's going to, again, trigger insulin release. So again, if insulin is high, it suppresses melatonin. Melatonin isn't able to work like it's supposed to. So those are two big things. I don't know about you, but I hear pretty commonly people eating before bed, and then of course looking at their screens before bed, which then keeps that cortisol and insulin high and the melatonin low.
Absolutely. Yeah. And alcohol is another piece of this puzzle too, which does have some pretty negative insulinogenic effects.
Yeah. Super cool thing about melatonin is that it's not just our sleep hormone. It is actually very, very important for our body's detoxification processes. And so that's often overlooked as well. It's not just, oh, my melatonin's low, so I don't sleep as well. It actually prevents your body from being able to heal and detox and repair overnight as well. So really supporting melatonin is a really big deal as far as overall health and longevity. The other really important thing to understand is that when insulin is high, not only does it disrupt melatonin, but it also disrupts leptin. Leptin is our satiety hormone, so when we feel full, and leptin primarily is going to work overnight. So again, insulin's low, leptin can do its job. And what it does is leptin kind of scans the body for its current energy stores and says, hey, this is how many energy stores we have. Here's what your appetite needs to be like the next day to be able to function and do what it's supposed to do. So if we have too much insulin, again, we had a snack, we're having blue light, things like that before bed, leptin can't do that. And then what we find the next day is because leptin wasn't able to do its job, we're overeating our nutritional status because it is off, and we tend to overeat because our leptin wasn't able to send the correct signals for the next day.
Absolutely. And that's a really important point in terms of how does sleep actually affect appetite. And there's a mountain of studies to show and look at that interrelationship of how important sleep is for appropriate appetite and those appetite cues too with leptin and ghrelin and other hormones. Okay, so let's pivot a little bit directly to intermittent fasting. And this is a huge topic for us. We talk about it every day in clinic because it's such a useful tool for helping reverse or at least slow insulin resistance, especially in adults. Now, it's a little bit different in kids. Their bodies work a little differently, so intermittent fasting isn't quite the tool in most children that it is in adults. But for adults, what we're looking at is decreasing inflammation within the body, and a big piece to that is insulin exposure throughout the day. So with intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating, if we can have a period of time where that individual, whether it be 14 hours, 16 hours, even up to 20, 21 hours if they're doing like one meal a day, that longer fasting window helps decrease that insulin exposure. And during that period of time, what we're trying to do is sensitize the body more so to insulin. And as long as we're making good food choices, having appropriate portions within that eating window, they should be able to reap the benefits of not only decreased inflammation, but we do see lower triglycerides, a reduction in visceral fat over time. And again, remember, visceral fat, or that fat that we have internally around the organs, that is pro-inflammatory. It's releasing those cytokines from that visceral fat itself, and more of an inflammatory organ internally for all of us as adults. Intermittent fasting can lower blood pressure, lower LDL, have significant effects long-term also on cardiovascular disease risk too, simply because we're looking at that interplay of how well the body uses insulin and how much inflammation is actually present. A couple other benefits of intermittent fasting are on those digestive hormones. So it can decrease ghrelin over time, or more of that hunger hormone, increase leptin, our satiety hormone. And there's always an interplay between those two where we want to make sure that those are at healthy levels. Otherwise, it can lead to abnormal eating habits, abnormal hunger cues as well. One of the awesome pieces with intermittent fasting when it's done well is improvement in mood, and an improvement in overall mood because of the effects on blood sugar, on mood as well, and then also cognition. So when we think about feeling mentally sharp, you and I both, we intermittent fast on a daily basis, and it's a huge piece to mental acuity, short-term memory, being able to get the words out appropriately and function at a high level in conversation. That's a really important piece for a lot of us professionally, just in terms of our regular job responsibilities. And a big piece to that with intermittent fasting is the improved neural connections, or those connections that those nerves are actually making, which impact cognition. With the gut microbiome, or all those bacterial species that are within our gut, there's improvement over time with intermittent fasting. And a lot of that has to do with the increased insulin sensitivity. In the gut, intermittent fasting can also reduce permeability, or that lining of our digestive tract. We want to make sure that that is appropriate in keeping the wrong things out of the bloodstream. We don't want the bad things going through that wall, and it'll improve that permeability over time. And then also increase diversity of the bacteria of the gut, which we need that diversity for the gut to break down materials and digest appropriately. Finally, when we think about cleanup or autophagy, intermittent fasting has a big role in this, especially with longer periods of fasting. And that's where we're looking at those cells, whether they be cells that are not functioning very well anymore, like they're called senescent or zombie cells, or those cells that are damaged. And that can be with free radicals, that can be due to oxidative stress. But intermittent fasting can help trigger more aggressive cleanup, getting those B and C level cells out, so that we have a healthier environment overall. Prior to 1960, a lot of people were not eating 3 meals a day. And then as 3 meals a day started becoming more popular in America, we saw an increase in diabetes, an increase in heart disease, also increases in cancer during that period of time. And a lot of that had to do with increases in that insulin exposure in the average adult American. When we see those small, frequent meals throughout the day, those are going to keep insulin levels high, at a higher level than if there's a more prolonged period of fasting. And people basically are having increased glycogen stores in the liver. They're never able to access fat for fuel. And so over time, we do see body fat percentage increase, and it just plays a part in that role, that perpetual cycle of worsening the insulin resistance.
So kind of tell me a little bit more about how do we fast? What does that look like?
So fasting is going to be individualized for each person, but the goal of fasting is to control blood sugars and insulin, and ideally, for many of us, to tap into fat as a resource for energy. And when the body flips into fat burning, that's dependent on the individual and that individual's glycogen stores, usually somewhere between 12 and 36 hours, depending on the individual and how much glycogen is present in the liver. Now, what they've found in research is clean fasting tends to be more advantageous than dirty fasting, or fasting with kind of some cheat drinks, cheat caloric intake in there.
Can you explain that a little bit more? What is a clean fast?
Yeah, so clean fasting is going to be nothing calorically significant and nothing that causes insulin release during that period of time when the individual is fasting. So water, black coffee is totally fine. Unsweetened tea that is not calorically significant. Those are all going to be what?
Or flavored.
Correct.
No
yeah.
Flavors.
Yeah. If there's flavoring or if there's any artificial sweeteners, that is going to cause insulin release through cephalic insulin release, which we'll talk about a little bit later too. But the brain doesn't know. The brain can be tricked by these artificial sweeteners like sucralose and aspartame, those things that don't contain calories. But when it gets into our mouth, our body thinks, hey, there's calories, there's food coming, this is calorically significant, and I need to release insulin, and it does shortly after that. So a clean fast is going to be something that avoids any of that early insulin release by the body. Chewing gum, that's also going to release some level of insulin. So technically, it does break a clean fast.
How about this? I get this question all the time. What about cream in my coffee? Or MCT oil in my coffee? Or what's the other one I hear?
Butter.
Butter.
We do have people who put butter in their coffee.
So what about those things?
They break a fast. There is one important thing that people can put in their coffee that will not break a fast, and that is ice cubes. So you can drink it faster.
Got it. Thanks for that.
I do this every day.
All right. So you were talking about kind of clean fast, what that means. You mentioned something, cephalic phase insulin release. What is that?
Yeah. So cephalic phase insulin release is the early release of insulin that occurs by flavoring or us tasting a food or sensing sweetness in our mouth. So it is that early insulin release even before a food or a drink gets into our digestive tract, the esophagus down to the stomach. This is all occurring due to what's happening in the mouth. And it's that first release of insulin.
Yeah. So I think to take that a little step further for people to understand. So when they have gum on an empty stomach, like right away in the morning, they're fasting and they chew gum and they have that cephalic phase insulin release, they're going to release insulin, but there's no calories. There's no actual food for that insulin to use or to do its job with. And so that's when they feel kind of that sugar low.
Correct.
Because now they are releasing insulin, which is bringing sugar down, but they didn't actually have anything bringing sugar up.
Correct.
So that's where you have to be really careful and know that, hey, sometimes it's just because I'm drinking a flavored water or I'm chewing gum. Any sort of flavor can trigger that cephalic phase insulin release, which then can actually drop blood sugars if you're not actually eating and you feel hangry, you feel like you need to eat.
Yeah. And the two main types of intermittent fasting are going to be time-restricted eating, which is what we're talking about with like a 16-hour fasting window or a 14-hour fasting window, even up to like a 21, 22-hour fasting window with a 1 meal a day type eating pattern. And that depends on the individual. And it is okay to change that up a little bit too. It doesn't have to be a 16 to 8 fast every single day on the clock. It can be something where there's some flexibility there. I even have some people who will on the weekends do 3 regular meals, and then Monday through Friday it is more of a prolonged fasting window. And that also can change up for women, especially women in their childbearing years, because of changes in their hormonal cycle as well each month.
For sure. It's so important that we're not restricting during that luteal phase. So that week to 2 weeks building up to your period, you should not be doing extended fasts or a lot of restricting in that time frame. The other thing that, like you mentioned, it is important to switch that up because of something called metabolic adaptation. So if we're consistently doing the exact same things every single day, your body will adapt to that, just like lifting weights. You hear, well, if you don't ever change up your workouts, your muscles get used to that. You don't really see a lot of progress or a lot of change in your body composition. The same thing is true with fasting. If we're not switching up our fasting, our body becomes metabolically adapted and it's not producing the same results that it does if we're switching up those eating windows. Absolutely.
And that's a really good point. I think a lot of people believe, I have to do this 16-hour fast every day. That's what it is universally for everyone. And like you said, switch it up. It's something where play on that person's strengths as well. Some people are great with a certain type of intermittent fasting schedule, whereas other ones like a 16-8 are very difficult to execute, especially over a prolonged period of time. The other one is going to be alternate day fasting. So up days and down days basically mean higher caloric intake days, lower caloric intake days. We use this some. I would say I don't use it as much as time-restricted eating for the average person, but on the eating days, it's important not to restrict foods. Basically, to let that person have that higher caloric intake. At the same time, food composition still matters. You don't just want to be eating a whole bunch of processed foods, because I haven't seen people have significant benefit with that, or free-for-all days. For the best results with alternate day fasting, people should actually have a 36 to 42 hour clean fast. And what that does is that helps reset the body. Then they're going into that up day or the higher caloric intake day, coming off of a more prolonged fasting period. And it is important that it is a clean fast for that period of time too. There are studies that have looked at this, and the alternate day fasting does show increased muscle, decreased fat compared to just a low calorie diet. So having that the metabolic change-ups that occur with alternate day fasting is really important for overall physiology versus just restricting all the time and slowing down metabolism.
So basically an alternate day fast is where you're fasting for a day and then you're eating, correct? The next day, the following day. And then same thing, like the next day you could do a fast for the full day, or, eat for 2 days, fast for a full day, then eat for 2 days, fast for a full day.
Correct. Yeah. And this is something that there needs to be a lot of work that goes in on the front end to personalize that, not only to that individual, but also that individual's schedule and commitments, because it can be a little tricky if we're trying to do alternate day fasting exactly the same for everyone.
For sure. And the thing I see too is that most people aren't ready for this. Like, it's not just something you jump to. You really have to work your way into it, because so many people are metabolically inflexible and insulin resistant to begin with. And so you will not feel well if you just jump into this right away. Like, you have to have someone kind of walking you through that process.
Absolutely. And when we look at eating habits overall, that time-restricted eating does tend to be something that's more universal to people compared to the alternate day fasting. I have very few people who continue to do an alternate day fasting protocol long term.
So one of the reasons I like alternate day fasting, and I will use this tool for some of my patients who really need to get and want to get into that fat storage burning for energy, is the literature does show us that this is the most effective fasting style to really get into fat stores. So if you think about it, it makes sense, right? Because the longer we're fasting, the more we're able to get through glycogen and then get into fat burning. So if we're every single day doing more of a time-restricted eating, we're not getting into those fat stores as efficiently. So this can be really helpful when you have those patients who are really struggling to get into fat burning. You almost have to have some of these longer extended day fasts to get into fat burning. Some of the things that can help with this actually is working out fasted. That's going to help you get into that energy, pulling that energy from fat sooner, because again, your body needs it. So it's going to get into those fat stores more quickly. Yet, however, I don't recommend really high intensity interval training if you're on a long extended fast, because that can actually increase cortisol, stress, all of that. So exercise fasted is great, but not anything super high intensity. The other thing that I'll really educate patients on when we're looking at alternate day fasting is if your goal is to get into that fat burning for energy more quickly, you could do a little bit more low carb the day before, because again, you're going to have less of those sugar stores to burn through before, keeping you from getting into fat burning as quickly. So a little bit lower carb the day before. Don't be afraid to work out fasted. And then those longer fasts are actually going to get us into fat burning for energy a little bit quicker. The last thing that I like to use alternate day fasting for is actually for my patients where we're seeing we're concerned with some potential clogged liver issues. So maybe that's on blood work, or maybe that's just from a history with the patient. But alternate day fasting, those longer extended fasts can actually help clean out the liver a little bit more, especially with cholesterol and blood sugar and those types of things. So that can also be another useful tool. One of my favorite things about intermittent fasting, whether it's time restricted eating or alternate day fasting, is that it's free, right? So
Yes.
it's a very, very good tool for most people to be able to use to become more metabolically healthy and for longevity.
Yeah. And education plays a role too. I'm sure you've seen this in clinic where just educating people, it's not going to be significantly detrimental for most adults to fast for 24 to 36 hours. The upside is so much greater than any potential downside there.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the different lengths of fasting and the benefits associated with those lengths. Because they actually do have different purposes. So when we're talking about time restricted eating, we're looking at more of that 12 to 16 hour fasting window, like you mentioned. What we'll tend to see here is lowering inflammation and then also an increase in HGH, or human growth hormone. We're going to talk more about that. So remember that human growth hormone, it is our friend. It is what helps us build muscle. It helps us sleep. It just, again, helps with longevity. So 12 to 16 hours, we're going to see an increase in HGH. That 17 to 24 hour mark is where we're going to see getting into more autophagy. So that's cellular cleanup, as you had mentioned. And then the really cool thing is at that 24 hour mark, so 24:36 is where we're going to see that microbiome or that gut reset. So 24:36, if you're looking at for the gut benefits, is really where you're going to see that. So after 24 hours, the stem cells of the gut are actually replaced, which is a pretty incredible thing. Our body is just so incredible. 24 hours can also, that's where we're going to see the brain healing, again, the gut healing. This is very good for autoimmune patients. If you have some autoimmune conditions, again, because of the gut benefits that we see there. So improving immune system overall. And then some of our cancer patients will actually use that 24-hour fasting as well, and even up to a 72-hour, which we'll talk about. When we get into that 36 to 48 hour fast, so that 36-hour window, we're really getting into that fat burning. And that's what we were talking about with the alternate day fasting. So if we're looking for lowering visceral fat, lowering our fat stores, 36 hours is where we see the research showing us will be the most fat loss as far as duration of fasting. And it's one of the most common things that we see as far as anti-aging is some of those longer 36-hour fasts. When we get into the 48-hour fast, so this is a little bit longer, but this is where we're going to see the benefits cognitively and then our mood. So things like anxiety, depression, we're really going to get that dopamine reset around 48 hours. Also at 48 hours, that's where we see an increase in human growth hormone or HGH by 500%. So that's a pretty significant increase.
Wow.
If you're able to go for those 48 hours. The final fasting kind of period that is in the literature that's been studied is actually a 72-hour water fast. I have never done this. It's not necessarily an easy thing, and I don't recommend it for everyone, but these are going to be more, again, our cancer patients. This is where we're seeing peak autophagy, so peak cellular cleanup, accelerated healing, those types of things, reducing oxidative stress. I really don't recommend this more than 1 to 2 times a year at max. Again, depending on what your purpose and the goals are, but really you should be working with someone, a professional, on kind of how to navigate that and how to work into that if you're going to be doing a 72-hour fast.
Absolutely. And when we think about a cellular reset, this is one of the incredible tools that we all have access to that is free, like you had said, and just cleans up so much in the body that doesn't need to be present.
So I know that there's at least one study out there that showed a tumor growth reduction by about 65 to 90%, and this was in rats, so not in humans, but that's pretty incredible just by a 72-hour fast.
Absolutely. So as you know, there are a lot of opinions about fasted workouts, not fasting before your workout. Tell us a little bit about where you're at with that and a little bit of education on what's the best thing to do.
Yeah. So this is actually I would say a great debate even here at Flourish between some of the providers here, because everyone's a little bit different. So the first thing to understand is that everyone is different and everyone their bodies respond differently. Some of us are set up genetically where we benefit more from fasting and extended fast, and some of us do not. And so again, this is not a one size fits all, but the idea that women should never work out fasted if they want to change body composition and put on muscle is simply not true. So important things to understand. Again, number one, if we're working out fasted, we're able to burn through those glycogen stores more quickly and get into fat burning. So it's a great tool to ramp up fat burning. It also gets us into higher autophagy after exercise when we're working out fasted. So again, that's cellular cleanup. I think there's a common misunderstanding that if we're working out fasted, that the body is going to break down muscle for energy. And again, that's simply not true. It's going to go and use those fat stores to create that energy to sustain our workouts. In 2013, there was a meta-analysis done of all research out there around this idea of protein timing before and after workouts. And it was very interesting because I don't think you hear this a lot, but what we found was that there was no significant difference if protein was consumed immediately before or immediately after a workout. The differentiating factor there was the appropriate type of workout regimen and then overall adequate protein intake. So it wasn't that if you don't eat before, you don't eat after, you can't build muscle. That wasn't the case. It was you need to make sure you're getting overall adequate protein intake on a daily basis. Now, if you are a bodybuilder, right, and you are in the top 0.5% of wanting to really dial in on body composition, this is not those aren't the people I'm speaking to, right? That's a whole different protocol, algorithm, like very detailed plans need to be followed. But for the general person, it actually showed no difference in consuming protein before and after with regard to a workout, just making sure you're getting enough protein in the day to fuel those workouts.
And that's a really important distinction that you made is eating like a bodybuilder traditionally is something where people are eating every 2 to 3 hours. And it's a very regimented job like eating protocol. It's harnessing insulin to build muscle as much as possible, especially post-workout. And that is not what the average American needs for longevity.
For sure. One of the things that fasting does that we haven't really touched on is that it actually allows our body to recycle and upregulate branched chain amino acids, so BCAAs. Our body is not able to make BCAAs on its own, but when we are fasting, we do see an upregulation and recycling of these branched chain amino acids. This will then help prevent that muscle breakdown and actually encourage new muscle growth. I mentioned earlier the HGH, so human growth hormone. Again, fasting we know absolutely increases HGH. So working out fasting workouts, again, we're going to see increased muscle growth because of the stimulation of HGH. So think of it like this. I heard this once and I thought it was a really good thing to help us understand. So think of babies, right? They're in the most, muscle building, growing time of a human's life, and they have the highest levels of HGH at that time. They're not in the gym, right? They're not lifting weights, but they're putting on muscle. And that is because of that human growth hormone. So again, fasting, extended fast can really increase HGH, which can help with muscle gain. So again, there's kind of this big controversy. Should you work out fasted? Should you not? Are you actually going to see results? I personally work out fasted pretty much every day and have seen significant results with that. Again, that's genetically a part of how my body is put together. So it's not a one size fits all, but I do want listeners to understand that it's not this blanket statement that women should never work out fasted. And if they do, they're not going to see the results. It's just simply not true. Our body has so many mechanisms that can actually counteract that and increase muscle growth and reduce body fat by working out fasted.
Thanks for sharing all that information on workouts, and all of this surrounds that big hot topic of insulin resistance. So when we set up a protocol or work with a patient to set up a protocol to decrease insulin resistance, typically what it'll look like is 2 to 3 meals per day, or 2 to 3 times when that person is eating per day. And usually that's going to be packaged in a 6 to 8 hour eating window for most people. in the morning, the perfect way to have time restricted eating is going to be starting in the morning within about an hour of waking up, and then having that 6 to 8 hour eating window finish in the early afternoon with a longer fasting window before bed, and then throughout the night while that individual is sleeping. That higher protein signal at the beginning of the day is going to help with satiety or remaining full. And then in the evening, when we see cortisol levels going down and the body getting ready for rest with melatonin, that's an optimal time to be fasting. Now, for a lot of individuals, that's tough to do. And so if we move that eating window later in the day at, let's say, a 12 p.m. to 6 p.m. eating window, it's not the end of the world. And that works for a lot of people. Just the way most people's bodies function, it's not optimal. Now, they can still see results, but if we were to go by the perfect way to eat and fast, it would be that earlier eating window at the beginning of the day.
Again, just related to those circadian hormonal rhythms and how our body is made.
Absolutely. And let's keep in mind macros too. Higher carbohydrate or higher sugar in the diet is going to increase blood sugars. It's going to increase insulin levels. Whereas if we have more of the other two, protein and fat, that's going to tend to stabilize blood sugars, especially if we're eating those first. So when a person's eating, we always counsel them protein first with their eating habits. And then if there are going to be carbohydrates, those should follow ideally protein and vegetables, and then more carbohydrates after that.
Yeah. So carbs and sugars always last.
Yeah.
Always.
Yeah. And walking too. So walking is one of those unsung heroes. Walking for 20 to 30 minutes right after meals is a big controller for blood sugars and has a positive impact pretty much universally for adults. The other thing to stay away from is going to be snacking, especially snacking after dinner. That is the Achilles heel of a lot of adults, myself included. When we snack after dinner, usually it's going to the pantry for poor food choices, higher carbohydrates, higher sugars, and more of those processed foods as well that don't have the normal satiety cues. And so many individuals will eat too much of those snacks in the evening.
And then it keeps you up all night.
Yep, affects your sleep. Finally, apple cider vinegar before bed can be something that'll help stabilize blood sugars as well. And very few people utilize apple cider vinegar, but that can be a helpful tool.
Yeah, I've had some patients do this even before meals. Can be helpful, just stabilizing blood sugar. It does not taste great. So you can either choke it down, just do like a little teaspoon, tablespoon straight, or mix it in some water.
Another piece to the insulin resistance equation is looking at hormones and how men, and the reason we should talk about this is because we do talk a lot about hormones here at the clinic. But with men, the main one we're looking at is testosterone. And when that drops off, typically late 20s, early 30s, that's when we see some effects on insulin resistance, because testosterone at optimal levels will help a person manage blood sugars better or be more insulin sensitive. Now for women, we see testosterone drop off typically mid to late 20s, and then estrogen and progesterone, the other two main sex hormones, dropping off around perimenopause and into menopause. When estrogen drops off, what we tend to see in that perimenopausal time frame is the body is not using insulin as effectively, or basically that more insulin is needed. And then what will happen is, as that insulin resistance just starts to rise, predictably, we see body composition change in that perimenopausal time frame. And we'll see this in many women saying, hey, I'm starting to add more belly fat. I've never had midsection fat in my past. What is going on? I haven't changed how I eat. I haven't changed my exercise or my sleep habits, but my body is different. And that's what we'll see with those hormonal changes of estrogen and progesterone starting to decline during perimenopause and into the menopausal time frame.
Yeah, so estrogen helps those cells respond better to insulin. And so almost pretty immediately postmenopausally, we're going to see an insulin resistance develop, which means either we're addressing it with estrogen, we're replacing your estrogen, or you're making sure you're really lowering your carbohydrate intake to help combat that insulin resistance, and then potentially along with some different intermittent fasting strategies as well. The thing that you mentioned about testosterone, I think to kind of understand that a little bit deeper is that when, testosterone's our muscle feeder, right? It helps us put on muscle. Our muscles have insulin receptors. You had kind of mentioned that earlier where it helps build muscle, right? Eating after workouts. But when we lose muscle mass due to low testosterone, we're actually lowering our insulin receptor availability. So now there's more insulin floating around in the bloodstream, hence more insulin resistance. So testosterone and estrogen are so important for helping with insulin sensitivity and diabetes prevention.
Absolutely. And we're seeing adults live longer now and longer with lower levels of hormones. And that can lead to some of these more dramatic effects with insulin resistance too, because of how that long time period. The other one we shouldn't miss is cortisol. Because cortisol is a necessary circadian hormone like you had talked about, but we see cortisol having what's called an inverse relationship with both testosterone and progesterone, which is very impactful for men, but especially for women because it's touching on both of those sex hormones. And so as cortisol levels go up, that stress hormone cortisol, whether it's because of professional stress, relational stress, anything that's causing that fight or flight hormone to be released in higher levels, we'll see testosterone and progesterone effects suppressed or down on the lower end with that.
All right. So to wrap up, we're going to talk about CGMs a little bit. This is a tool that I like to use for some of our more complex patients or patients who sometimes I have women and men who do not look like they would be pre-diabetic just from an outward, like they don't have a lot of visceral fat, like it just doesn't seem to line up. And so CGMs or continuous glucose monitors can be super helpful to help us know what is causing these high sugars. So this is you've probably seen them before. They're that little sensor that you wear usually on the back of the arm. Mm-hmm. The cool thing now is that there are some over-the-counter options, and so you don't have to have insurance approval for this. The one we use, the Stello, is only about $90 for a whole month of sensors, and so super affordable to give us invaluable information. So what this will tell us, when I have patients do this, one of the things that they say, well, my blood sugars don't ever go out of the range. So there's kind of this preset range in there. That doesn't mean that your blood sugar is okay. If you're having significant fluctuations, that's a red flag. We want our blood sugars to be pretty stable, respond to meals, but then again, get back to that baseline. And so just because it's in range doesn't mean there's not a blood sugar issue. So a few of the things that I like to kind of educate my patients with, if you're going to use the CGM, things you want to watch for, you want to track, I say use the first sensor don't change anything, don't change the way you're eating, use that first sensor to really figure out what's causing spikes. So you have to write down your foods, write down your workouts, and record it in the app. And then figure out that you will see trends. What are the specific foods, maybe things that you didn't even realize that are really spiking your blood sugar. So those are things you probably need to avoid. The other thing that it tells us is if stress is raising that blood sugar. And so I've had this before where patients literally have almost a perfect diet, but every time they would have high intensity workouts, their sugars would be super high and their body was having a hard time recovering. And what that tells us is that that's just too much stress. There's too much stress there. They were postmenopausal, so the estrogen was low. So it was too much. Their body couldn't regulate those blood sugars, and we really needed to cut back on activity and stress in general. So a couple things to watch for with CGMs. Number one, when you eat, those blood sugars really shouldn't go up more than 20 to 30 points. If they're raising more than 20 to 30 points, that means you did not have the appropriate portioned macros for that meal. So you'll see kind of what your starting blood sugar is. And then after you're done eating, if it went up more than 20 to 30 points, you need either more protein or more fat, or fewer sugars and carbs, or all of the above. The other thing that we want to see is that 2 hours after the meal, so you have your baseline, here's what my level was prior to eating. 2 hours after you finish eating, you need to be back to your pre-meal baseline as well. If you're not, again, our protein, carb, fat ratios are imbalanced. We need to make some tweaks and some adjustments there. The other thing I'll see on different CGM readings is we have a lot of highs and lows overnight. If you're seeing that, this means that your cortisol and your insulin are up and down all night long. And so we either are eating too much later in the day, or we're eating too late in the day. So either too heavy of a meal later in the day, or just eating too late in general. So things to do there is move that last meal up, lower those amount of carbs and sugars with that evening meal, and then really cutting out those foods that are causing significant spikes as well. Remember, we cannot heal, we cannot build muscle, we cannot have what we call memory consolidation or that cognitive function overnight if insulin and your blood sugars are peaking and troughing or going up and down all night long. So a good kind of overall goal for blood sugars at night is to run anywhere from 75 to 100 at max, like very stable. I really prefer people 70 to 85 range is where we really should be hanging out overnight.
Absolutely. And that's something, as you've seen, it's pretty obvious on a CGM when a person is eating too late or having too many carbohydrates or sugars in the evening, because that activity in terms of blood sugar movement is dramatic, especially in those first 4 hours of sleep.
The other thing that we can see is midday spikes can also cause some irregular overnight readings, so being aware of that. And then if we're seeing super high blood sugar, that means we need to, again, adjust those fats and proteins to help stabilize blood sugar. Because as you mentioned earlier, carbs and sugars are going to raise blood sugar significantly, whereas fats and proteins, you'll see a slight raise, but not as significant. So we need to increase those if we're seeing a lot of high levels on that CGM. So that's why I love that tool. It's cheap. It's pretty darn affordable for most people. That second sensor, I'll tell people, okay, now we're going to put that second sensor on and we're going to make tweaks and we're going to make adjustments and we're going to watch and see, do those sugars level out for you? And so I have found that to be very, very helpful in those people who feel stuck or we're just not sure why their numbers are looking the way they are, or we're not seeing the needle move as far as weight loss. So a CGM can be really helpful. If you do the Stelo version, we as providers are able to have an account and help make sense of that data. So again, it's a great tool that is pretty affordable for a lot of people. And
with Stelo, now each sensor is 2 weeks still, correct?
Yes. Yep. So you get 2 sensors for, I think it's like $89. So that would last you for that full month. All right. I think that is it. Anything else, Tad, that you think we missed that would be good for the listeners?
The biggest takeaway is when developing a plan, for everybody listening out there, it is important to develop a plan that is personalized to you. It does need to play off of strengths and weaknesses. There are times where I'll talk with someone about time-restricted eating, and they have tried it in the past, and it was a dumpster fire. It really did not work well. So we need to work through why didn't this work, and how can we either pivot this type of eating or scrap it and move to a different approach. And that's really important to talk with a provider who has experience in eating habits and longevity as well.
For sure. And it's just like everything that we do here. Everything really needs to be individualized and very specific for that person, because unfortunately, there is not really a one size fits all in anything, exercise, nutrition, hormones, like literally anything, because our bodies are all a little different. And so there can't be a one size fits all.
Yeah. And that's the fun part of it too. For us as providers is really digging into that and finding the equation that works best for that person.
Yeah. So that's all for today. Our next podcast will be coming out in the new year. So stay tuned for what we'll have up for you guys in 2026.
God bless everybody.
Thanks for listening in to the Flourishing Life podcast. You can watch this full video version of this podcast inside the Spotify app or on our YouTube channel. If you like this episode, please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast app. And be sure to share this episode with a friend. And follow us on socials at Flourish Medical Wellness and on our website at flourishmedicalwellness.com. The information on this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not intended to replace medical advice or to be a substitute for professional medical diagnosis or treatment.